Whenever we think about the history of human morality, we almost always picture something incredibly rigid, right? I mean, we immediately picture Charlton Heston coming down the mountain carrying these massive, heavy stone tablets. The rules are literally carved in rock. They're binary, they are absolutely absolute, and if we're being totally honest with ourselves, they're kind of comforting. But what if those ancient, rigid rules weren't actually the end of the story? What if they were just the starting line of a massive psychological evolution? Today, in this explainer, we are going on a really fascinating journey, taking us all the way from those stone tablets to the development of a modern internalized ethical compass.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the ancient scaffolding, move right into the great software update, explore Paul's paradigm shift, decode the ego's ultimate surrender, and finally wrap it all up with trusting the internal compass. And I promise you, by the end of this, we're going to take some incredibly dense ancient Greek texts and theology and connect them straight to the frustrations of your morning commute. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the ancient scaffolding. Why exactly humanity needed rules set in stone?
So, human psychology naturally craves safety. We absolutely love the predictability of clear-cut binary rules. Think about the 10 Commandments. Do this, definitely don't do that. It creates a very safe, predictable boundary for an early society to operate within. But as human consciousness has evolved over the millennia, our relationship to those rules has completely transformed. It really forces us to ask, were those ancient rules the final destination or just the starting line? We tend to view historical morality as this fixed, unmoving destination. But when you actually trace the theological and psychological history, those stone tablets start to look a lot more like a necessary starting block for human consciousness.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at how the Apostle Paul viewed the ancient law. He used this very specific, kind of fascinating Greek word, pedagogos. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, a pedagogos wasn't just your friendly neighborhood school teacher. It was a strict slave or guardian who was completely entrusted with the discipline and protection of a child until they reached maturity. Paul saw the strict ancient laws, like, say, keeping the Sabbath or not stealing, as a developmental milestone. They were essentially a really strict babysitter. Or better yet, think of them as training wheels for humanity during its absolute infancy. I always like to think of this like the scaffolding around a giant building under construction. You absolutely need that rigid, external metal framework to build the structure, right? If you don't have it, the bricks fall and the whole thing just collapses. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the scaffolding must come down once the internal support beams are solid. If you leave all that scaffolding up after the building is finished, it literally becomes a hazard. It rusts, it restricts access. Keeping rigid laws forever actually restricts the growth of the internal human conscience.
Which brings us right to Section 2. The great software update, moving from simple behavioral compliance to true character transformation.
So, the transition from needing that heavy external scaffolding to actually trusting an internal strength is this radical shift in human development. And it was brought into incredibly sharp focus by Jesus. But actually, before we get to the famous Sermon on the Mount, we have to look at a super fascinating historical discrepancy. In Matthew 19, a young man asks Jesus for the ultimate recipe for eternal life. Jesus explicitly tells him to keep the commandments, but the specific wording varies depending on which ancient manuscript you're looking at. The oldest critical text reads, "Why do you ask me about what is good?" which is kind of this brilliant philosophical redirect. But the later Byzantine texts say, "Why do you call me good?" which focuses entirely on divine identity. So why the difference? Well, it's basically ancient version control. Early scribes noticed differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke and tried to harmonize them all. But regardless of this fascinating scribal editing, the original Greek command to actively guard the rules remains completely undisputed. So, Jesus upheld the ancient law, but then he goes and completely alters the mechanics of how it operates. The old OS, the old operating system, was entirely about behavioral management. It was boundary lines and, frankly, external fear. But Jesus introduces a new operating system, character transformation. By equating anger with murder and lust with adultery, he wasn't deleting the old code. He was optimizing the code to run on a completely new piece of hardware, the human heart. Think about it. You aren't avoiding murder just because you're terrified of a stone tablet anymore. You avoid it because your internal disposition has actually shifted toward love. It's a real game changer. Let's keep moving to Section 3, Paul's paradigm shift, navigating the absolute chaos of early grace. Because Jesus made the law an issue of the heart, a massive historical point of confusion suddenly emerged. For the last 2,000 years, people have fiercely debated whether the Apostle Paul just chucked the rulebook right out the window. Many people in the first century believed that doing so would invite total anarchy and chaos. But here's the thing, Paul didn't contradict the software update at all. He brilliantly split the concept of the law into two distinct categories, a flawed means of salvation versus a holy moral guide. Paul argued that we flawed humans are fundamentally incapable of keeping the law perfectly. Therefore, there's no way you can use a checklist system to earn your way into salvation. And his proof was pretty airtight. If you could just checklist your way to heaven, then the whole cosmic tragedy of the crucifixion was completely pointless. So Paul didn't abandon morals to invite anarchy. He transitioned the underlying motivation. The mechanism he used to explain this is the Greek word katology, which means reconciliation or removing the barrier of enmity. Paul unpacked how human consciousness is literally rewired. Before, the compulsion to act right was based on external fear. Through reconciliation, that compulsion becomes entirely internal. You act right because of a true transformation of love. But how does that rewiring actually happen in practice?
That takes us to Section 4, the ego's ultimate surrender. We're going to decode the actual mechanics of the cross here. Let's face it, human nature is incredibly stubborn, right? You can't just tell someone, okay, operate out of perfect love right now and expect it to magically work. There had to be a mechanism to actually rewire our consciousness, which leads us to Paul's fiercely debated concept of the atonement. Because Paul was trying to describe a literal cosmic mystery, he threw a few different first-century frameworks at the wall. The most common model we see in the West is sacrificial and penal substitution, this idea of paying a legal debt to satisfy God's justice. Now, there is some fierce modern pushback against this from critics who call it divine abuse, arguing that it paints God as a cruel father demanding a violent blood payment. Because of this, scholars also point heavily to the Trinitarian model, where the entire Godhead participates in human suffering, and the Christus Victor model, which frames the cross as a sort of subversive underground defeat of the dark powers of sin and death.
But, there is an alternative, much more neutral view to consider here, the unavoidable collision. What if the crucifixion wasn't about God demanding a violent payment at all? Just think about the physics of it. If absolute, perfect, completely selfless divine love enters a fallen human system that is entirely governed by ego, power, tribalism, and violence, what is going to happen? The system is going to violently crush it, for sure. The cross was just the inevitable result of perfect love colliding with a deeply broken system from the inside out. And we can actually connect this historic, cosmic collision directly to modern psychology. The Greek word for sin is hamartia, literally meaning missing the mark. Think of an archer completely missing a target. If the ultimate target of human evolution is unity and non-separation with the divine and with each other, well then the separate ego is the very thing that misses the mark. It defines itself entirely by its boundaries. I am me and I am not you. It is completely trapped in separation.
In this psychological framing, the crucifixion functions as the ultimate archetype for the death of that separate ego. But here is the profound paradox that literally keeps philosophers up at night. You cannot use the tool to dismantle the tool. The ego simply cannot kill itself. If your ego proudly decides, I am going to destroy myself to achieve supreme spiritual enlightenment, well, that's just your ego acting on a shiny new desire. It's like trying to bite your own teeth. It's impossible. The ego is way too proud to actually pull the plug on itself. The ego has to surrender to something larger than itself, an external breakthrough of absolute love.
Which brings us home to our final section, Section 5, Trusting the Internal Compass. Let's bring all this cosmic stuff right down to the commute. So how does an external breakthrough of absolute love, happening some 2,000 years ago, directly apply to our modern, chaotic daily lives? How do we actually internalize this? Well, the philosopher Rudolf Steiner had a truly unique way of explaining the spiritual evolution. Pre-Golgotha, or before the crucifixion, humanity had this instinctual connection to an external divine light, like needing laws written on physical stone tablets. But the mystery of Golgotha was the turning point. By passing through death, the divine spirit permanently united with the earthly sphere. Post-Golgotha, we don't look up to the sky for external light anymore. Humanity cultivates that internalized impulse directly from within. It literally took the operating system off the cloud and installed it directly onto our human hard drives. So the crucial takeaway is how this actually shows up when your alarm goes off, your coffee spills, and reality hits. Picture this. You're stuck in a deeply frustrating morning commute, and someone abruptly cuts you off in traffic. The old OS, that external law, instinctively wants to scream, "Who is breaking the rules here? Who's in the wrong?" But trusting the internal compass means bypassing that external urge to be the rule police in everyday conflict, so you can live fully from the heart. You just stop asking who broke the rules, and instead you ask yourself this: how is your ego keeping you separated from the person next to you right now? That is the ultimate shift, guys. Moving from an external babysitter to an internal compass of true correction. It is the profound, lifelong journey of taking down your own psychological scaffolding. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, keep seeking those internal shifts, and I'll catch you next time.